Ladies and gentlemen, I am 65 and these days I avoid people. Why? Not because I despise them, but because I have seen through them. You see, when you walk long enough through life streets, you begin to notice the echoes. The same jokes, the same complaints, the same complaints, the same masks, the same questions, how are you? Without really wanting an answer. When I was younger, I thought being alone meant being lonely, but now I know being surrounded can be far lonelier. At 65, I have no appetite for noise without substance, no taste for relationships built on expectation rather than understanding. People often ask me, why don't you come to the gathering? Why don't you socialize more? I say, why should I sit among circles where silence is awkward and performance is normal? I do not avoid people because I think I'm better. I avoid people because I value what is real. In this age of mine, I treasure energy like gold. I do not spend it where it is not honored. Every word spoken must carry weight, not just fill time. Some people nourish you, some only nibble at your spirit. So now I sit with trees, I laugh with birds, I watch shadows move across my walls, and believe me, these companions lie less, judge less, need less. This isn't sadness. This isn't bitterness. This is the peace that clarity brings. I am 65, I avoid people because I have finally found the joy of simply being. As the years accumulate, like the dust on old windowsills, quietly but persistently, one begins to see more clearly through what once appeared full of sparkle and depth. The way youthful energy makes noise seem like music and distraction feel like connection. But as age walks in like a silent guest who does not knock, you begin to realize how most words were spoken only to fill silence, how most smiles were rehearsed for approval, how most invitations were obligations dressed up as warmth, and in that awareness, the soul grows still and a little weary of the endless dance of human performance that never really meant what it pretended to mean. You remember those gatherings where laughter echoed off the walls like some sacred chant, but now you see it was mostly nervousness trying to wear confidence, people clinking glasses not in celebration but in an attempt to drown the hollowness they dare not name. And you understand that while everyone craves connection, not everyone knows how to offer it without a mask. And so the same games play again and again. Who's more successful, who's more admired, who's more… all this theater repeating like clockwork, draining the soul, dimming the spirit, asking you to play a part in something that you now recognize as less than real. At 65, you sit in a room and suddenly feel the weight of every conversation you had where you said yes when you meant no, where you praised what you did not admire, where you laughed to keep the air light even though something inside you was sinking. And now that your body has slowed and your calendar has loosened its grip, you wonder why so many years were given to people who never once asked how your silence felt or how your breath changed when you were tired of pretending to be okay. There is something tragic and yet oddly liberating about watching the facade crumble, watching how people fade when you stop feeding them attention, watching how their warmth cools when you offer no benefit, watching how quickly they forget when you no longer serve a function in their carefully managed lives. And it's not cruel, it's not even personal. It's just the way many have learned to survive, not by relating, but by networking, not by loving, but by leveraging, not by seeing, but by scanning for opportunity in human form. And so you begin to retreat not in bitterness, but in wisdom, not in isolation, but in reverence for your own energy, because at this age, peace is no longer a luxury, it is a necessity. And you learn that being alone is not the same as being lonely. That silence is not empty but full of things you never heard while the world was talking over you. And in that space, in that sacred space, you begin to meet yourself again, unmasked, undistracted, unashamed. You no longer chase company just to avoid the discomfort of your own thoughts. You no longer perform joy for people who do not care to see your sorrow. You no longer attend gatherings that smell like obligation and sound like exhaustion. And instead you sit with the breeze, with the morning tea, with the rhythm of your own breathing, and it is enough, more than enough. It is finally what you are always longing for behind every handshake and every forced smile. A sense of being held by life without needing to hold anyone's attention. Some might call it withdrawal, some might label it antisocial, but you know it is sacred. This pulling away is not collapse, it is convergence, not sadness but clarity, not resignation but return, a return to what is simple, a return to what is true. A return to yourself as you were before the world told you who to be and how to belong. And now, as the fire burns slower and the noise fades further, you understand that most social interaction was never really about connection. It was about distraction. And now you no longer wish to be distracted from the miracle of just being. And so you sit quietly, contentedly, a little apart, but more deeply within, knowing that this stillness is not loneliness, but the reward for having traveled through the illusions of interaction to find the rarest thing of all, your own presence, your own peace and the deep, wordless knowing that life in its raw and unfiltered form is enough. There comes a moment, not loud like a trumpet, but soft like dew falling before dawn, when the soul begins to ache not for company but for quiet, not for noise but for nuance. And in that moment, solitude no longer feels like absence, it feels like presence, it feels like presence. A presence untouched by performance, unshaped by opinion, where the self begins to unpeel its layers and reveal something far more raw, more real, more luminous than anything ever reflected back in the eyes of others. In the hush of solitude, the world slows down just enough for you to hear what's always been there. The pulse beneath thought, the quiet voice beneath the noise, the deep knowing beneath the doubt, and you begin to see not with the eyes that scan, but with the awareness that watches patiently, without judgment. And in this sacred stillness, the chaos of the world begins to unwind, untangle, and what once felt urgent suddenly feels irrelevant. What once felt heavy begins to lift like morning fog. Because when you're alone, truly alone, not distracted by devices or by the demands of another, the mind is forced to stop running its rehearsals for conversations that never happen. It has to stop performing for an audience that isn't there. And in that stillness, the masks fall not with drama but with grace. And beneath them, you find a face that has waited a long time to be seen, not by the world but by you. Tired, honest, quiet, but awake in a way the crowds never allowed you to be. You begin to realize how much of your life was spent reacting, adapting, adjusting to fit into rooms that never knew how to hold you. And now, in the silence of solitude, you feel your own edges for the first time. Not the version you edited for comfort, but the full, unfiltered truth of who you are when there is no one else to impress, no one else to compare. And in this rawness, a strange freedom emerges, not the loud kind that needs a flag or a fight, but the soft kind that lets you exhale without apology. And clarity arrives not with thunder, but like a lake clearing after a storm. Slowly, naturally, beautifully, thoughts that once tangled now begin to align. Desires that were borrowed from others begin to fade, and truths that had been whispering for years finally speak clearly. Not because they grew louder, but because you finally grew quiet enough to hear them. And that is the gift of solitude. Not that it isolates you from life, but that it finally connects you to it directly without translation. You no longer need explanations for everything because in solitude you realize the mind's obsession with meaning is just another way to stay busy. And instead of solving, you begin sensing. Instead of chasing, you begin receiving. And in that receiving, a deeper intelligence reveals itself. Not the intelligence of logic, but the wisdom of presence. A knowing that does not come from books or voices, but from the silent rhythm of simply being with what is, without resistance, without expectation. And in that space, free from the projections and pressures of others, clarity blooms like a flower untouched by hands, slowly but fully, and you begin to see not just yourself, but the world. With eyes unclouded by urgency, with a heart no longer weighed down by obligation. And suddenly even the smallest things shimmer with meaning. The way sunlight rests on your hand, the way breath enters and leaves without needing your permission, the way being alive, here now, is enough. So you stay, not out of retreat, but of reverence, not because you reject the world, but because you finally recognize what the world could never give you. Your own undivided attention, your own sacred space, your own clarity that comes not from doing more, but from being still enough to remember that everything you truly needed was always within you, waiting quietly, patiently for you to be alone long enough to come home to yourself. There comes a time when you stop trying to outrun your own exhaustion, when you finally notice that your spirit doesn't burn out in a single moment of drama, but dims quietly over years of saying yes. And you meant no, over long conversations that gave little and took much, over small talk that chewed through your attention like moths through silk. And as the body slows and the seasons pile upon your skin, you realize that your energy, once thrown around like spare change, is now gold sacred not to be wasted on what does not nourish you. You begin to understand that not every call needs answering, not every invitation deserves attendance, not every crisis is yours to solve. And slowly, without fanfare, you start pulling back not out of anger or not out of pride, but from the deep knowing that your time and your presence are no longer renewable the way they once were, that every breath counts now, every step matters, and you can no longer afford to pour your life into buckets with holes simply because they beg for your water. In youth, you gave so freely, mistaking movement for meaning, thinking that being everywhere with everyone all the time was some sign of success or significance. But now at this sacred threshold of age, you see how that very scatter of your energy left you thinner, dimmer, disconnected from your own source, and so you begin to retreat, not as a coward, not as a hermit, but as a keeper of the fire who finally understands that flame needs tending, not exposure to every passing wind. So you become selective not because you think you're superior, but because you have suffered enough from offering your essence to those who only came with buckets, not candles. And it is in this discernment that a deeper self-respect is born, a soft, steady refusal to participate in the draining, in the endless explaining, in the performances that require more energy than they're worth, and you choose instead what fills you. The quiet walk, the book that waits for your attention, the silence between your breaths that holds more wisdom than hours of shallow speech. You realize there is a cost to every interaction, not always visible but always real, and you begin to feel it in your body, in the heaviness after small talk, in the tightness after pretending, in the fatigue after being around those who do not see you but expect you to shine anyway. And so you listen more closely to your own nervous system, to the way your shoulders rise when certain names appear on your screen, to the way your gut clenches when you agree to things you no longer have the heart for. This isn't selfishness, it is sacred economics, it is spiritual ecology. It is learning the art of conservation not just of resources but of self, because you've learned that it is far better to give fully to a few things than to offer fragments of yourself and in distractions and in distractions and in this… Your energy begins to return to you slowly, steadily, like a river remembering its course after being dammed and diverted for too long. And with that eternity, clarity deepens, joy becomes less frantic and more rooted. And you find yourself no longer needing to impress, to perform, to prove, because you are no longer surviving through the approval of others. You are now sustaining yourself through alignment, through rest, through the wisdom of saying, not today, without guilt and a yes, only when your spirit rises in response. So you move slower, speak less, guard your mornings, protect your evenings, and within that rhythm, life becomes not smaller but richer, not quieter but truer. And you begin to realize that conserving your energy is not about doing less, but about doing what truly matters with your whole being, and letting the rest, the noise, the draining, the endless reaching, fall away like dead leaves, making space for something more alive to take root. There is a kind of wisdom that does not come from books or lectures or even from years alone, but from the quiet that remains when the noise is no longer fed, when the hands stop reaching for the next thing and the eyes stop scanning for what's missing. When the body sits still long enough for the truth to surface on its own like a ripple settling on a lake that has forgotten the wind, and it is only when the distractions fade, the devices, the duties, our luck, the endless buzzing of what others want from you, that you finally begin to hear what your own life has been trying to say all along. In the constant stimulation of the world where something always wants your attention, where urgency wears the costume of importance and busyness pretends to be purpose, it becomes nearly impossible to tell what is real and what is reaction. And so much of your life becomes a blur of notifications, quick attention, of obligations, of conversations that fill time but empty meaning. And it's not that wisdom isn't speaking, it's that it's drowned beneath the weight of too many voices, too many screens, too many choices that all lead nowhere deep. But when you step back not as a rebel but as a seeker, and allow the mind to settle, allow the heart to unclench, allow the silence to stretch wide enough to hold you, something miraculous begins to unfold. The thoughts that once ran wild begin to fall in. The feelings you kept avoiding begin to speak, not to hurt you but to free you. And in that undistracted space, insight begins to rise not like lightning but like dawn, slow, inevitable You begin to see enough friends in your own behavior that once hid in the noise, begin to feel the subtle pull of your deeper values, begin to notice how often you moved not from truth but from fear. And with that noticing comes release, because distraction kept you numb but awareness sets you in motion. Not frantic motion, not the anxious spinning of wanting more, but the calm, deliberate motion of alignment, of living from the center rather than the surface. It becomes clear that wisdom was never absent, only obscured, hidden behind the clutter of consumption and comparison. And when that clutter clears, when you stop needing to be constantly entertained, constantly informed, constantly occupied, you find yourself remembering things you never learned in school. the quiet strength of patience, the sharp edge of discernment, the deep peace of not needing to explain yourself to anyone who refuses to understand you anyway. And in that simplicity, the mind becomes sharper not through stress but through stillness, like a blade that cuts better when cooled and honed rather than burned and beaten. And life becomes less about figuring everything out and more about listening, truly listening to the deeper current beneath the surface of every moment, where wisdom speaks in subtle signs, in the body's change, in the timing of events, in the way your breath shifts when you're finally in the right place. Distractions shrink, and with them go the illusions of control, of perfection, of being everywhere for everyone. And what remains is you, not the edited version, but the present one, aware of what matters and no longer chasing what doesn't, and that presence becomes fertile ground for wisdom. Because only a still heart can reflect the sky, only an undisturbed surface can reveal the truth hiding beneath. And so you stop scattering your attention and start inhabiting your life. And from that place, you begin to live not from habit but from awareness, not from noise but from knowing and wisdom, not loud, not flashy, walks quietly beside you, teaching you to pause before reacting, to observe before judging, to value what endures over And as the distractions fall away, one by one, like leaves from an old tree, you realize that the silence you once feared is now your greatest teacher, your clearest mirror, and your oldest friend. There comes a moment when all the searching outside begins to fade, not because you found everything you were looking for, but because you finally stopped running long enough to feel what was always there. And in that moment, not marked by lightning or revelation, but by the simple weight of your own breath returning home to itself, you discover that the most enduring joy does not come from achievement or applause, from being loved or understood by others, but from the quiet flame that burns within you when you are truly present with yourself, without needing to fix, prove or escape. It is not the kind of joy that dances loudly in the streets or announces itself in pictures, but the kind that settles gently in your chest when you realize you are enough as you are here now, without performance, without decoration, just the pure and steady awareness of being alive, being aware, being awake to this breath, this body, this single moment. And once you touch that place, even for a moment, everything else becomes less desperate, less loud, because you no longer need the world to confirm what you already feel within. You begin to see how much of your life was spent in pursuit, of validation, of goals, of connection, and though none of these are wrong, they were often hollow because they came from absence, from a sense of being incomplete. But presence does not chase, it receives, it welcomes, it watches. And in its embrace, you start to taste joy not as a spike of pleasure, but as a warm, constant hum beneath all your rising and falling, a hum that says you belong, not to them, not to any role, but to life itself. In presence, your thoughts may still come, your doubts may still whisper, your memories may still visit, but you are no longer swept away by them because you have found an anchor deeper than thought. The anchor of awareness, of simply watching without… of breathing without needing to change anything, and in that simple watching, in that raw and wordless witnessing, joy begins to bloom not because life is perfect, but because you are no longer at war with it. You start to notice how the smallest things begin to shimmer again, the sound of wind through a curtain, the warmth of sunlight on your skin, the silence between your own heartbeats. And you realize you do not need to escape to temples or retreats or distant mountains to find peace. Because the temple is already within you, and its doors open not with effort but with attention, with the gentle act of saying, I am here and mean. This joy does not depend on anyone staying, on anything going right, on any dream coming true, because it is not tied to outcomes, it is rooted in awareness itself. The deep and silent knowing that no matter what changes, no matter what breaks or heals, you're here, watching, feeling alive, and that is more than enough. That is everything. And so even when life becomes uncertain or heavy, there is a place within you that remains untouched, a place that whispers, this too is part of it, stay with me. And slowly your presence becomes your home. No longer a momentary stop between distractions, but a sacred dwelling where nothing needs to be added or removed, where the mind can soften, the body can rest, and the heart can finally be held, not by someone else but by your own open hand. And in that embrace, in that quiet reuniting with yourself, joy is not something you chase anymore. It is something you carry, something you become. So you walk a little slower, breathe a little deeper, speak a little less, and live with the quiet certainty that everything you searched for, peace, freedom, love, was never lost. It was just hidden beneath all the noise you once thought was necessary, and now, in the presence that grows within you like a light that needs no fuel, You find a joy that does not rise and fall with the world, but stays, watches and gently, endlessly holds you as you are.